Oh, well, it seems we're live, so that just leaves it for me to say hello and welcome to the Saturday streaming edition of Adam's Music Box. And today I want to talk about a fun and interesting subject. I call it musical instruments out of place or musical instruments where they don't belong. Now, what do I mean by this? Okay, let's just forget the sound of music, not the Julie Andrews thing, but literally forget the sound. Listen to music with your eyes and observe, think of the picture I'm about to paint. You're in a club and you see an upright bass lying horizontally, you see a grand piano, you see a small drum set, and you see a saxophone lying on a stool. What genre of music do you think you're about to hear? Most people would say jazz. Now, let's say you're in a big concert hall and next to the chairs on a big stage, you see scores of violins, dozens of celli, the plural of cello. You see eight or so contrabassos. You see some trumpets, some clarinets, some flutes, a timpanist. Okay, you're seeing a European romantic style symphony orchestra, large string section, large horn section, etc., large wind section. Okay. Now, just to, I think you get the idea by now, but let's say that you're in a club and you see two turntables and a microphone. You're going to see something hip hop derived. Oh, so you get the idea. Now, why is it that certain instruments and certain combinations of instruments are indelibly associated with certain genres? And moreover, why is it that these certain genres tend to be very, very hesitant to let new instruments into the picture, into the tribe, if you will? Well, there's several reasons. One of them is about money and marketing. Musical instrument makers, musical instrument publishers have a vested interest in promoting certain instruments in certain places over others. The other thing is habit. If there's a tradition that's been going on for X number of years, and that tradition's been established in the minds of the people that both make and listen to music, there develops a kind of natural, unspoken hesitance to allowing new instruments to creep into the club. As George Carlin said, it's a big club and you ain't in it. Who would have known that it applies to the arrangements of musical instruments? And then the third thing is ignorance. Let's say that you've been composing for the traditional symphony orchestra in the European classical or romantic tradition for all of your life, and you don't want to have to learn about the advantages, virtues, and limitations of a new instrument. What we've got is plenty enough. Says the man who doesn't want to learn about more. And this actually happened when a man called Adolf Sax, pardon me, invented his saxophone. Now, the saxophone came around in the 19th century when orchestras were expanding in size, but the kinds of instruments in the orchestra weren't changing all that much. Now, Adolf Sax invented his saxophone, or saxophone as some call it, to be included in the traditional European orchestra alongside things like the clarinet and the flute and other the oboe, the bassoon, the cor anglais or English horn, and all these other woodwind instruments. There weren't that many takers. There was Bizet, who got Bizet with adopting the saxophone for some of his music in the 19th century. But on the whole, the saxophone was rejected by orchestras for a combination of commercial pressure from the publishers and the fact that old habits die hard and new habits are not easy to adopt. But something else happened, and by the turn of the 20th century, the saxophone was everywhere. It was in military bands, it was in marching bands, it was in concert bands. And then something else happened. It became the instrument that is most associated with a hugely important genre, and that genre is jazz. Whenever you see sort of a marquee for a jazz club, it's probably going to have a picture of a saxophone on it, neon light shaped saxophone, before it's going to have any other instrument. In the same way that if you think classical orchestra, you're going to probably think of the violin as the king of that particular class. When you think rock and roll, you're going to think the electric guitar. So Adolf Sax had the lost laugh because his instrument came to define many of the burgeoning genres that became highly influential in the 20th century. And it was at this time that a lot of other orchestral composers, late 19th, early 20th century, began taking the risk and adopting the sax. Not a lot, but enough for people to notice. The French, in particular, were quite fond of the sax. I did say sax, not another word with three letters that we sometimes associate with France. But Debussy and Ravel were very much into saxophone. Ralph Vaughan Williams, the English composer, used it for his Sixth Symphony. In Russia, they tended to adopt it too, perhaps because the Russian classical tradition began with Mikhail Glinka in the beginning of the 19th century, as opposed to the European classical tradition, which traces its origin all the way back to the earliest centuries of the Roman Catholic Church. In Orthodox Christian countries like Russia, the church never adopted instruments. There was only chanting. And so that sort of gave Russian classical composers more of a clean slate. So you have people like Glazunov, a Russian composer who lived a long time, well into the 20th century. He did a very well beloved among the saxophony community saxophone concerto. um, Richard Strauss, which is interesting because not a lot of German composers use sax in classical music, but he used both the soprano, alto, tenor, and baritone sax in his 1903 piece, his highly programmatic Sinfonia Domestica, the first sort of day in a life type of music that we've got. Ibert composed a saxophone concerto. Villa-Lobos, the wonderful Brazilian composer, did as well. And then when you get to ultra modernists, people like in the contemporary era, like Philip Glass, you've got a saxophone concerto as well. But the saxophone always stands out like a sore thumb in classical music because we're not used to it. Whereas the absence of the saxophone in, let's say, a jazz quartet would be equally disturbing to those who are easily disturbed by musical processes. So you can see how a lot of this is psychological rather than sonoral. It's really about a mindset or a commercial model rather than a sort of instrument as a whole. Now, what about jazz itself? I've mentioned jazz a lot. Now, one of my favorite jazz artists is someone who played a musical instrument that is unusual in every genre except one that is made for it, the pipe and drum band. And I'm referring to the bagpipes. You don't hear bagpipes in many settings other than with other bagpipes and drums, whether it's in Scotland or Ireland or the east coast of the US. Bagpipes sort of do their own thing, and it's because they're very unruly. They don't have dynamic range per se. They have some harmonic limitations, but they're a really interesting instrument that I've always loved. And Rufus Harley was a wonderful jazz musician who never gave up on his dream of integrating the bagpipes into jazz. He began on the saxophone, as you would as a jazz musician in many cases, but he watched the JFK funeral from 1963, and the Black Watch from Scotland played the pipes at the funeral. And this really moved him. He wanted to play the bagpipes. So he traveled to New York City and he looked for a pawn shop that had a set of bagpipes. He bought them and he never looked back. Now, on this sort of list, discussion, call it what you will, that I'm doing, I want to make it clear that I'm sort of excluding novelties. So, for instance, Sir Malcolm Arnold composed a piece called A Very, Very Grand Overture that, in addition to the regular modern orchestral instruments, it was scored for two vacuum cleaners, a mop, and, other sort of cleaning devices. It was him sort of joking around. That was an intentional novelty. So I'm not including novelties. I'm only including instruments in unusual places that are played in a manner that is serious and that integrates into the rest of the sound. Now, very few people have had much luck integrating bagpipes into anything, but Rufus Harley was brilliant at integrating the bagpipes into bebop, hard bop, avant-garde jazz, jazz fusion, any of the jazz genres in the 60s, 70s, and 80s when he was at his peak. He was playing the bagpipes. He played them with Sonny Rollins, for instance, and it was a trip to see it because there he was, Black African American guy from Philadelphia, not a Celt, not Scotch, not Irish, not anything. Um, and he was playing the bagpipes, and he had the full garb. And because of that, he developed a fan base in Scotland. They sent him kilts, they sent him sporran, they sent him the whole nine yards. And it was great to see him perform, because when he marched onto the stage, people were, oh, this sounds like this is going to be a novelty. The visuals are sending you inaccurate cues. But he actually did something amazing. He turned these bagpipes into a fully fledged jazz instrument, so much so, need some water, so much so that as you were watching him perform, you almost forgot that this instrument isn't a traditional jazz instrument, because he played it with the ease and with the stylistic tendencies with which he was previously playing his saxophone. And to me, that is not only commendable and virtuosic, but it's really, really interesting. And again, it proves that. A lot of our hesitance to see or even hear instruments in a context that is unusual, a lot of that is sort of an internal confirmation bias. Another wonderful jazz musician playing an unusual jazz instrument is the wonderfully talented Dorothy Ashby, one of my favorite musicians of all time. And she was known for being a great jazz harpist, the first one ever. Her first album, appropriately enough, was from 1957, called The Jazz Harpist, and it was a collaboration with the wonderful jazz flautist Frank Wess, great musician as well. She played all sorts of different kinds of jazz, from the sort of cool jazz of the 50s with a lot of modal tendencies, to more sort of boppy jazz, to jazz fusion, to avant-garde world jazz. She did it all across all of her albums, and I recommend listening to all of them. Most of them are now on the streaming services, and she really does amazing things with an instrument that, even in its classical setting, is more designed to create flourishes and embellishments than it is to be a super integral part of the music. Another great jazz harpist was best known as a pianist initially. She is, of course, the great Alice Coltrane, wonderful, wonderful musician, the widow of John Coltrane, of course. And it was around the time of his death that she began to play the harp and integrate that into her increasingly avant garde jazz. Some call it spiritual jazz. Really interesting stuff, very much of its time, timeless nevertheless. She was very close to Pharoah Saunders, collaborated him just as sure as Pharoah was very close to John Coltrane in Coltrane's final years. Definitely listen to her albums, including, and I'm going to mess up the pronunciation, Journey in Sachidandanda, something like that. It's named for something from Hinduism, I believe. Wonderful album, though, from the early 70s. It's on your streaming services. Check out Alice Coltrane. She is amazing. Now, going back to classical for a minute, we can talk about other instruments that really should have taken off, but never really took off beyond several composers. And I'm talking specifically about the Wagner tuba, which was invented by Richard Wagner. And it was designed to create a broader middle sort of lower mid range, if you will, to the brass section of your traditional orchestra. And it quite a number of people did compose for it, but not as many as should have, because it was really a wonderful instrument. So of course Wagner incorporated it into his music, as well as Anton Bruckner, who was someone whose career was helped by Wagner. Bruckner, because he was seen as a simpleton, was rejected by the Vienna elite, but Wagner, who was already a total superstar at this time, luckily helped him get his career going. A man who's often thought of as the successor to Wagner, Richard Strauss, used the Wagner tuba a lot, and a lot of sort of modernists used it as well. Bela Bartok from Hungary used it. Janacek, the modernist from what was then Czechoslovakia, used it. Schoenberg used it. Stravinsky used it. Edgar Varese, a modernist that Frank Zappa grew up loving. Um, pardon me, God, this humidity is killing me. He integrated it into his music. And so I think that it should have been more widely played, but there you go, the Wagner tuba. So we can turn to violin, which is obviously the king of the instruments in classical, and its relationship with jazz is an interesting one, because when jazz had its more folky roots that tied it to both proto country in Western and North America, and so called gypsy music in Europe, you could see the violin in jazz quite a lot. There were people in Europe like Stepan Grappelli, there were people in the United States like Stuff Smith, and then the violin tended to retreat as jazz became ever more brassy and horny. Not like that, idiots. Um, but then by the fusion era, we see the violin coming back. We have people like Jean-Luc Ponty, who, in addition to his wonderful solo work, played with the Mahavishnu Orchestra, Frank Zappa, George Duke, great musician. You see Jerry Goodman from Mahavishnu Orchestra, the sort of classic lineup, if you will, and many of the other solo projects that he did. And so people got accustomed in the age of fusion to seeing violin as something that, while not your typical jazz fusion instrument, it was nevertheless something that wouldn't shock people. So I tentatively put violin on a list of shocking jazz instruments, but not really, because between Stuff Smith and Grappelli, it has a legacy in the early days of jazz and also in the modern jazz fusion where anything kind of goes. Now, also in jazz, we see non Western percussion instruments being integrated into jazz a lot in the 60s, and this trend really tended to continue. This was when jazz was becoming ever more international, avant garde, and experimental. And so, in addition to your typical drum set developed in America by Baby Dodds and then made famous by Gene Krupa, you see all sorts of African hand percussion. You see Asian, Indonesian, Indian percussion. I would say that, yeah, while this would have been something that might have shocked people in the early 50s, by the time you get to the 60s and you see a lot of hand percussion on stage at a jazz club, it's really not going to shock anyone the way that, let's say, bagpipes or harp would at that same time. Um, and so, if by the way you out there in Radio Land have any if shocking instruments in unusual places that I'm forgetting, please do let me know either in a live comment or in a comment that you leave ex post facto. Now let's turn to rock and roll. And I'll start with the least controversial of these, which is the saxophone. Because from its early days, because of its roots in relation to R&B, which from its earliest days was a heavily saxonified genre, the sax was in songs like Rock Around the Clock. Little Richard's bands had saxophone. Wasn't unusual to see Elvis play with the sax. And so while the music got louder as the amplifiers got more powerful in the 60s, we see the saxophone retreat. It never goes away. It's always hanging around, whether it's in Bob Seger and the Silver Bullet Band, Bruce Springsteen and the E Street Band. There's, of course, one of the most famous sort of modern rock singles, which is Baker Street by Jerry Rafferty. And the whole thing is built around a saxophone solo. There's so many more that I'm forgetting because, again, saxophone is not uncommon in rock, especially when the style of rock, harkens back to its R&B, its soul roots. Now, I would say that, funnily enough, rock and roll has some of the fewest shocking and surprising instruments in it compared to any other genre, and we have technology to blame because as rock and roll was coming along, so too were the synthesizer and its cousin, the sampler. Now, what this meant is that if you wanted unusual sounds in a rock and roll band, you didn't need to learn a new instrument because synthesizers and samplers are either piano style keyboard based or they're computer based. Either way, they're not a new sort of a traditional new instrument that one would have to learn, the way that a classical composer would have to learn how to score for the saxophone when Adolf Sax introduced that into the lineup. And so the first sampler was an analog sampler, and it was called the Mellotron. It was a huge organ like instrument, but inside of it were tapes. And the tapes contained recordings of all of the major instruments. And if you press down, middle C and had the switch dialed for violin, you'd get violin playing C. If you put it on saxophone mode, you'd hear a sax. You could have a choir. You could press down a key and hear the choir. That was the first sampler. It was an analog tape-based sampler. And Mellotron was all over rock in the 60s and 70s. Eventually, synthesizers that were somewhat more reliable, analog synthesizers, tended to either accompany or, in some cases, subsume the role of the mellotron, especially in the late 70s when you had string synthesizers that came around. And then by the tail end of the 70s, it was really almost over for unusual instruments in rock because you had the first ever computerized digital sampler, the very expensive Fairlight CMI, where you could take any sound that you find in nature, sometimes called found sounds. You could take any instrument, you could take sine waves and manipulate them to do whatever you want. You could set them to a rhythmic pulse. And so suddenly, one instrument with a computer module and a piano style keyboard could do what you need. And because this instrument came into being at the height of rock's commercial prowess, and some would say artistic prowess as well, there was a clear disincentive for rock musicians to bring new instruments in because, from the convenience of a computerized digital sampler, you could get just about any sound you wanted. And this trend throughout the 80s became the rule rather than the exception, with things like the Emu emulator, another sampler, when it came to things like sequencers that came out in the 80s, MIDI that allowed these things to talk to each other, the synclavier, which Frank Zappa played a lot. You could compose anything from it. And so again, this disincentivized rock music from doing that. Now, a lot of rock bands did play with orchestras, sometimes as a novelty, sometimes as a way of making them integral to music. I don't need to rehash all of that now because I did an entire other video on that, so do check that out. But we know Your Days of Future Past by the Moody Blues, but then they replaced the orchestra with just the mellotron rather than having both on their first album. You have Deep Purple Concerto for Group and Orchestra. ELP played with orchestra. Metallica later on played with orchestra. But I will say that when it comes to things like violin and cello, one band did fully integrate them into the band. So it wasn't band plus orchestra, band featuring orchestra. It was an integral part of the band. And I'm referring, of course, to the Electric Light Orchestra that incorporated cello and violin into the real part of the band. So while you had the usual rock instruments, you had all sorts of electric pianos, organ synthesizers played by Richard Tandy. You had your drums, your bass, your guitar, your vocals. You also had two cello and a violin. It really was the Electric Light Orchestra, a chamber orchestra at that. And so I will say that they were definitely, of a mainstream rock band that had a lot of popularity, all of it well earned. They integrated these instruments. But again, when we see classical and jazz, well, no genre is really open to mixing up the instrumentation. The closer you get to the age of the sampler and the sequencer, the less people are willing to experiment with new instruments. But that doesn't mean that they're not willing to experiment with new sounds. Just look at how different 80s music sounded than what came before it because of the rise of sequencers and samplers and all sorts of new digital instruments that allowed you to manipulate sound. Things like the synclavier, things like the Fairlight CMI. Now, like I was saying, if there's any one genre that integrates instruments less than rock, it's hip hop. But hip hop is a unique animal in and of itself because hip hop harkens back to something that happened almost at the same time as very early rock, in some ways before. And this was the experimental electronic music that some classically trained musicians, mainly in Europe, were doing in the early 50s. Things like musique concrète in France, things like what Stockhausen was doing in Germany. And part of this was using music reproducing equipment as musical instruments, namely the tape machine, the tape recorder. And so, what is the basis of hip hop? Well, it's using a piece of electronics that we think of as something designed to reproduce music, the turntable, and it's turning it into a musical instrument. So, there we see a link between what Karlheinz Stockhausen was doing as early as the 50s and what the hip hop guys started doing in the 70s before hip hop became mainstream in the 80s and took over in the 90s. And of course, hip hop relies heavily on sampling. And you could also say that while the drum machine was something that existed on sort of the fringes of rock. It existed when Phil Collins was about to walk his way to the drum set. In hip hop, you could say that the drum machine is central in the same way that the violin is central to classical, the electric guitar is central to rock, and the saxophone is central to jazz. So that's where hip hop went. And ironically, the analog turntables and early drum machines were later on replaced by computer workstations that could simulate both. In the same way that with rock, you get the mellotron and then you work your way into it all being computerized. So that's that. There's other examples of unusual instruments in unusual places that are a kind of global phenomenon rather than a technological or commercial one. I mentioned that African percussion instruments that became increasingly prominent in jazz represented this trend in the 60s. And then there was Indian musical instruments being integrated into rock beginning in the late 60s. Now, the question I have about this is, was the sitar an instrument from the Indian raga classical tradition? When this was integrated into many rock songs, was it done for musical reasons or religious and cultural reasons? It's a difficult call because few rock musicians ever really mastered the sitar in the way that it's played by the sitar masters of India. A lot of it might have been a cultural fascination with India. George Harrison was converting to Hinduism at this time. He brought over the sitar, played it on the Beatles album, Sgt. Pepper's, and before that, the Magical Mystery Tour EP. Then the Rolling Stones had to have one, and before you know it, everyone in San Francisco and London was playing an instrument that they hadn't heard of a year before. Well, one of the good things to come out of this is that Western audiences got exposed to the way that the sitar is supposed to be played, because Ravi Shankar, in particular, the king of raga, began making multiple appearances on TV shows like The Midnight Special, and he started to sell records in places outside of India. So that was, of course, interesting too. I spoke a lot this week about Monk Montgomery introducing the electric bass to jazz, but that was really a different story because the electric bass hadn't really existed until the early 1950s, and Monk was just one of the first to play it. And because he was a jazz musician, he played it in jazz ensembles the way that he was previously playing the upright bass. But shout out to Monk. I know one of his, I think, children or nephews actually watches this channel. That's wonderful. I think that that's really amazing. So hello if you're watching this. So these are sort of examples of out of place instruments. You could even say that the guitar in classical music, but it would really be non-Spanish classical music because Rodrigo and other Spanish composers are all about the guitar because the guitar is the king of Spanish classical music, even though we might think of it as a pop or rock instrument in other places. But few non Spanish composers use the guitar in the setting of classical music. Villalobos did, but he was certainly from an Iberian offshoot, if you will, a New World Iberian offshoot. So we can put an asterisk there, but that is definitely an interesting thing to consider as well. Cello in jazz is never was as common as violin in jazz, but Duke Ellington used it a bit. Jack Bruce was a cellist before he became a bassist, and he integrated it into his rock and his jazz fusion as well. Electric guitar in classical music, not very common, except if you're Pat Metheny or if you're Ingve. But again, the electric guitar is something because amplifiers and orchestras, it's hard to get a sound balance. That was one of the problems with the sort of Deep Purple collaboration with orchestra. That wasn't a concerto for electric guitar specifically, it was for group and orchestra. But Ingve did one specifically for electric guitar. Pat Metheny from the sort of jazz fusion world did something similar, and Pat Metheny I think deserves a shout out of his own because he's always integrating interesting and unusual instruments into his playing. And we could also say that guitar synthesizers are in that route, but then again, you can synthesize everything, and this sort of hints at that trend I was talking about earlier, where once the synthesizer and the sampler came in, all bets were off. Well, that's my take on things. Let me know what you think. You can leave a comment, send a super chat, do all of that other stuff. So, as always, We will see you next time. Like, subscribe, take care.